Thanks for being here, Mr. Marcus Bleasdale. I'm going to start with asking you a few questions about your personal journey into photojournalism. And then I'm going to move forward with asking you a few questions about your first few photojournalistic projects, especially in Kosovo and Sierra Leone. And then from there, I'm going to then move to your more famous projects like the war in Congo and CAR. And also briefly touch upon the books that you wrote revolving around these issues. And then I'm going to also ask you a few questions about the political issues revolving around these conflicts. And then I also have a few questions about some of your other interesting projects that you did in Djibouti and Tanzania. And then finally, I'm going to ask you about your visit to India and the conflict that you covered in Kashmir. So jumping right in, firstly, how did you become a photojournalist? Can you tell me about your journey into photojournalism?
Well, I didn't start out in a traditional way in photography. So I studied an undergraduate degree in economics and finance. And then I went into work with the investment banking in the City of London for many years, nearly a decade, actually. And there came a point when I knew that wasn't going to be a lifetime career. I didn't really want to spend the next 30 or 40 years of my life doing that. Big respect to people who do it, but it really didn't suit my personality in the longer term, although I did enjoy the time that I had there. So I was always looking, what is it that I could do if I'm not doing this? And I had started to study a little bit in the evening, printing and photography. Although I would just class myself as a hobbyist and nothing else. And then it was a time when the wars in the Balkans were ongoing, and somebody in the office said to me, there had been a particular massacre that had been reported, and because the Balkans conflicts were very close to Europe, on the borders of Europe at that time, now part of Europe, actually, the Balkans, a lot of them. And so, we were, it really did impact on currencies when things were, when conflicts sparked up. And so somebody asked me what this particular massacre would do to the price of dollar mark, as it was then, the Deutsche Mark. And I just couldn't understand that this person had taken this kind of collective human suffering and tried to find a financial gain from it. And that for me was it. So I didn't even sit down. At the beginning of the day, I just walked in. I hadn't even sat down at my desk. And I just walked straight to my boss's office and I resigned and walked out of the bank. Those days, and probably still now, if you resign, you have to leave immediately. And so I left the bank, and 3 days later, I went to Kosovo to try to understand a little bit the conflict. And that really led me on a journey over a year in that region to, working and understanding what was really the root cause of that conflict. It was quite complex, still is quite complex. But one thing that came out of that process was that I started using a camera a bit more along this journey. And I knew at the end of it that I wanted to learn more about photography and narrative and how to build a narrative and understand how to use photography to create and engage with storytelling, policymakers and people around human rights issues. And so I went back to university and studied a postgrad in photojournalism at that time in London. And that was a year course. And during that year, I traveled to Sierra Leone as part of my school project or whatever it is, to see if I could start to document the impact that the conflict there was having on the population of Sierra Leone. And I did, and I was lucky enough to get access to some of the diamond mines that the Revolutionary United Front, as it was called, the RUF at the time in the 90s, were using to finance the conflict. Charles Taylor, Liberian president, Fori Sanko, the leader of the RUF, and they were collaborating in extracting diamonds to finance their conflict and also amass personal wealth for themselves. And so I documented these mines and came back to Europe just at the time when the conflict in Sierra Leone was exploding. And I had the only pictures from inside these mines, and they were published in the Sunday Times magazine and many other places. I was still at university at that time. But that really defined an interest for me, which is to try to look, because of my background in economics and finance, look at the economics of conflict. How do conflicts become financed? How do they maintain the finance within a conflict to maintain the payments of troops, of weapons, maintain interest in that conflict? So it really started a journey for me, and this was back in '99, for me to really look at the use of natural resources within conflict. How do we use gold, diamonds, tin, tantalum, tungsten in many conflicts to finance those conflicts and amass wealth around them in order to prolong those conflicts and prolong the human rights abuses that are going on as a result of them. So that's really where it started and how it started. And that journey to Sierra Leone started my life in Africa, and I stayed there for many years, 20 years nearly.
You had an interesting journey. Like, you just spoke about how you quit your job in investment banking and shifted to photography. Did you feel you had any unique strengths in particular that made you take this leap of faith?
Absolutely none, if you want me to be honest. I think it was just a hunger to understand a little bit more about the human rights issues that were surrounding conflict. That was really the motivation for me. It wasn't the photography, and I'm very clear that photography for me is a medium in order to engage a community and create a conversation and hopefully create some form of policy change as a result. So, just as an author uses a pen or a typewriter or a computer, it's just a tool for me to be able to communicate. I like photography. I don't love photography. I have some photographs on my walls, not many. It's not something I collect. It's just a process for me in order to communicate, and it's an effective process in order to bring in front of people, hopefully policymakers, people who can create change, the real impact of conflict.
When you speak about photography as a medium, how powerful do you think photography is as a medium to affect change? And how is that evolving in today's times when the video medium is really exploding?
Yeah, I agree with you that it's definitely on a journey. So stills photography, still a very, very powerful medium in whatever form it takes, in terms of, whether you want to express a particular landscape or a particular community, whether that be in India or in the UK or America. If it's a skilled practitioner and they're expressing themselves and trying to engage in a particular issue through stills photography, it's a very powerful medium. But it's clear that video is a significant part of the working photographers or image makers toolbox. And as a photographer, in the last 10 years, I don't think I've had a job where I didn't have to simultaneously shoot stills and video and create both stills and a story that could be published in a medium, magazines, online, and also create some form of video content that could be used, 10-minute video, 15-minute video, longer, half an hour, that could be used by the clients or the magazine or the organization that I work with to highlight the issue. So, for the working photographer, especially within photojournalism, video is a significant part of your life now if you want to work actively a lot. And if you're only providing stills, you limit your attractiveness to your client. So it's just another tool in the toolbox, really.
When you document a particular conflict, do you project your viewpoint of the conflict or just document reality as it is and let the audience decide?
I think it's nuanced. So, I don't go into a conflict that I know nothing about and try to project a vision and a view of it. which is why I, a lot of the time, just try to work in areas that I know very, very well. And so why I've spent so long in Central Africa documenting that region is because I really got to know it, not just the people and the culture, but the politics and the nuanced areas of conflict. But as you work in areas like this, it's on, especially around the issue of natural resource extraction and the use of natural resources to finance conflict, it's difficult not to have an opinion. I wouldn't classify myself as an objective journalist. I would classify myself as maybe a columnist in a newspaper that has an opinion and wants to express it. And as long as I'm clear from the outset that I'm expressing an opinion about what I think about this conflict, then I don't see that there's any conflict of interest. But that said, once I am documenting something, let's say as I did in DRC, in Congo, documenting natural resources and the impact that natural resource extraction has on the population of DRC, when there are over 5 million people killed as a result of the conflict, when there are, millions of people displaced, when, there's sexual abuse and child labor and child soldiers all around, it's difficult not to take an opinion, take a position on that, and express your opinion of distaste and disagreement that this is wrong. And that the natural resources being used to finance and prolong a conflict in this region is wrong, and that the practitioners that are engaged in it, whether they're multinational corporations or governments, are wrong. And so I take that opinion. Now, do I take a side between, for example, Hema and Lendu, two tribes that were fighting in that particular region? Or, do I take a side between one particular warlord and another? No, I document both sides of that conflict. And I think both of them are wrong. Both of them are fighting a war that shouldn't be fought, and both of them should put down their weapons and try to solve these issues diplomatically. But on the opinion of what the conflict is doing to the population, I absolutely have an opinion.
I have noticed you tend to focus a lot on the plight of children in your photos, be it child minors, child soldiers, victims of any form of violence. Is it because it has better impact or something personal?
No, it's just because clearly it was a large part of the story that both children were used and abused and killed in this conflict in a quite significant way. And they're an extremely vulnerable part of the population. And so, for example, if I'm in a refugee camp, there are the aged that are dying as a result of the ordeals that they've been through, and I documented that. And there are a large percentage of the deaths that are because the people are just too old and too frail and too sick to endure the hardships of living in an environment like that. But then, the other side of that spectrum is the very, very young who have just been born, the infants that have been born into this really unstable area where the access to sanitation and food is really challenged. And so they are a really vulnerable part of the population, and so are disproportionately impacted by the lifestyle that people are forced to live just because of their low immune systems and their very early age. So, I went to a camp, for example, in 2003, and, before 9 o'clock in the morning, I found that there were 15 funerals happening of children, not adults, but just children that had been born recently and that just didn't have the immune system to deal with the challenges. And much of it was malaria-based illnesses, whether that be, their immune system being impacted, the fact that they have malaria, the fact that their blood is being impacted by the fact that they have malaria. All of this is, it's just an extremely vulnerable part of the population. So in terms of health, children had it disproportionately were affected more than others. And then, it was also a conflict where children were targeted by warlords to be recruited. They are really, actually very good fighters, ironically, if they are treated in a very manipulative way by their warlords, and they use drugs and they use psychological techniques to really motivate these children to fight and fight at the front line. And so in many occasions, the children were sent first into battle. This doesn't happen just in the areas I was covering in Africa, but it happens actually globally. Children are used very much in the front line. I saw that a lot actually in Nepal when I was covering the Maoist conflict. Children were very clearly used in that conflict in the front lines. And so, children are disproportionately affected in conflict and disproportionately manipulated in conflict. That's why they appear a lot in a lot of my photographs.
Can you take me through your first few photojournalistic projects? I would be more interested here to know about your process back then and how it has evolved throughout the years. If I'm not wrong, I think you started in Kosovo.
I suppose I wouldn't class Kosovo as a photojournalistic project. That was more of a humanistic, educative journey. I was trying to educate myself and understand what conflict was and the impact that conflict has on population. But I suppose really the first full-on journey was Sierra Leone, and that really was Sierra Leone is a British colony historically, and so appears in the press a lot in the UK as a result of that. And the conflict there was quite well documented. And I just, again, really wanted to understand a little bit like Kosovo. So I wasn't anything more complicated than just getting a plane ticket and going there. I studied a lot the conflict beforehand and the politics and the history behind it. And really, again, with this economic mindset, tried to understand the economics of the conflict. Where was this money? How was this, in this state, how do we continue to pay people to fight in this way? How does that work? And so I just went with that one question as a thesis. And I think that, as photojournalists go to a place, if they have a thesis, if they have a question they want to answer, as opposed to just going and just photographing everything. This is what this place looks like because it's, a place in conflict. If you go with the thesis, really, I want to answer this one question in this conflict, then you have a much more focused approach. And actually then, your work becomes, I think, in my opinion, more relevant and more focused and more poignant and more impactful. So when I went to Sierra Leone, I just went there. I went there for a month and spent time getting to know people and the place and the culture and the logistics. And more often than not, photographing in places like this, the work is 80% logistics and 10%, if we're lucky, photography. It's about how do we get to places and how do we get there safely and how do we get home safely and where do we stay and how do we talk to people to get us access to that particular mine, or where is that mine, and how do we get a vehicle to get there, and where is that vehicle when we want to come home. And so all of these bigger questions and logistics based challenges are most of the job in regions like this, and the photography is a very, very small part of it. You're often planning something for 2-3 weeks in an area for 1 week, and then you leave, and you just do that time and time again over 20 years, But it's all about logistics, and security is a key part of it. So, young people, photographers, when they're going to an environment like this, shouldn't really be going without some sort of field skills. Or, if you're a photographer and you want to go to these areas, you generally study photography before you go. But very few people think about studying how to save people's lives. And so it's really important that young photographers, when they're going to environments like this, understand the field skills needed to survive in a place of conflict. And that if you're traveling through regions like this, that you need to have skills that can, if something happens to your colleague or your driver, you need to be able to assist to the extent that you can stop an arterial bleed or, assist somebody who's been significantly injured. And so, now I don't take anyone in my car who hasn't had, combat or conflict training in terms of, trying, first response training. And so that's probably the most important thing any journalist or photographer or videographer can learn if they want to go to these places. Yes, of course, study how to make images or make films, but they also need to study the first response aspects of being in places like this too.
How scared would you be when you reach conflict zones like Congo or CAR, or when you deal with, let's say, warlords or the local military? Also, do they like the part that they are being photographed?
No, just to answer your first question, most of the time when you're in these areas, it doesn't feel like a conflict. You're in a busy city and there's the economics of city life going on around you, and their restaurants and bars are open, and it's a normal life in Central Africa. And the war is generally going on out there somewhere in the bush. And you then put the logistics together and travel out of the city towards the area where the conflict is happening. And of course, that process of traveling out into the regions where the conflict is happening is one that you plan well with your colleagues and your network on the ground, so that hopefully you can do it safely. And you try to inform people that you're trying to meet along the way that you're coming, and sometimes that's quite challenging and in some cases impossible, so you just have to negotiate as you go. And of course, from time to time, there are things that you can't plan for, and your security is compromised, or somebody shoots at your vehicle, or you're, in some way you become the target, and then of course you have to deal with that emergency situation as it arises. But more often than not, those instances are quite minimal. In a 20-year career, I think I've probably been in a life-threatening position maybe 10 times in 20 years, and which might sound a lot, but in 20 years is not actually, especially when you're living in these areas. And so it's about good planning and good logistics and good knowledge and good communication. And then to answer a bit your second question, some people, warlords, they understand the power of communication and journalism, and so they use you to try to represent who they think they should be. And so they try to manipulate you to present an opinion or a vision or a view that they'd like the world to know. And it's, of course, our job to see through that and try to represent the truth. If someone is saying they're a peacemaker and they're here to, save the community that they're representing, but behind them, that they're using child soldiers and they're responsible for a particular massacre that killed 60 people a week before, that that there is another story, and you try to represent that story. So you generally get access to those warlords when they want to communicate to the world and tell them what they think in a structured way. In the field, if you're meeting soldiers, it's slightly different. And then that just becomes a spur of the moment conversation, whether people are comfortable with you being there and taking their photograph or not. And of course, that's a conversation and a negotiation. But you always ask. It's very dangerous to be in an environment like that without having quite a significant conversation beforehand about what you're doing there and why, and if they want to be a part of it. So it's definitely a conversation. But some people are open to it and happy, and others just say no. And then you respect that and you move on.
You just mentioned you were close to 10 life-threatening situations in your career of 20 years. Can you narrate any one to me?
I suppose I think whilst I covered Congo a lot, and I was in situations where we were under fire there quite a few times, but really the most challenging time that I've had was in Central African Republic in 2013, where the conflict was ongoing and it was chaotic. there was a large movement of population out of Central African Republic to the surrounding countries, essentially, ethnically cleansing the Muslim population from that community. And that was quite challenging. We were in an enclave of Bangui where the Muslims had been herded just at the outside of Bangui. I was there with a colleague from Human Rights Watch, and we were documenting daily life in this area where there were tens of thousands of people had been jammed into this very small area, and so it had become a health issue. And they were there waiting for transport to go out of this main city because they knew they couldn't live in the main city anymore. And as we were documenting this, we heard some shots, and we ducked, of course, and then we found later on that, and that's one of the photographs that maybe you see online, that somebody had been killed there, and they were carrying this man upside down, 4 of his friends, and he'd been shot by the French peacekeepers because they thought that he was demonstrating or firing shots into the French troops. It turned out to be a mistake. It was actually another source. But anyway, this man wasn't armed and he was killed. But that led to a whole series of repercussions, both from the Muslim population and the anti-Balaka population that was surrounding this Muslim population. And they started firing into this community. And so we were actually just attending the beginnings of the funeral of the first man that was shot. And then shots started to come into this funeral. And that became a really dangerous position. And we were in a couple of situations at funerals whilst we were, the local population were burying people that had been killed by one side or the other. And those funerals became the target of further action. And then, you had to run and take cover, and they became quite challenging, to say the least. When people are killed around you, that's, definitely a place you don't want to be. It's not a very pleasant experience.
I'm going to shift gears and now ask about your professional life. You had documented the war in Congo. In fact, you even released 2 books on the war in Congo. Can you give me a brief about your books, 100 Years of Darkness and Rape of a Nation?
Yeah, so 100 Years of Darkness was really the beginning of that journey in DRC, and it didn't really start out as a coverage of the war, but really, I started out to look at the impact that conflict had on society, and so I used the river. The river Congo. So I just traveled along the River Congo for 2.5 years, I think, in total, going in each time and starting at a different place. So, whether I started at Kinshasa and traveled to Bandaka, or Bandaka going towards Kisangani, or going back the other way, really documenting communities along that river, looking at how those communities have been impacted by generally the life in DRC and the economic situation post-Mobutu, and the current conflict that was ongoing in parts of that area. And so, that was really more of a kind of anthropological evaluation of Congo, whereas the second book was much more focused on, as you say, conflict minerals and the impact that that mineral extraction has had on the population. And so that was much more structured. And I think, if you want me to be honest, the first book was more a reflection of a personal journey, and the second book was more an insightful view of conflict. I think the second book has more journalistic rigor, and I think it has more depth, and I think it answers more questions than perhaps the first book raises a lot of questions, but the second book answers them.
What is the status of conflict minerals in 2020?
I think it depends on the mineral. So diamonds, there's limited war currently going on. There's a lot of corruption going on through diamonds, and mismanagement and political toing and froing around diamonds, but the current conflicts over access to them limited. But gold, this is a different story. gold is being significantly used, especially in Eastern Congo and around the Ituri region of Eastern Congo, still being used to finance conflict. And the conflict that I documented in 2003, 2004 in Eastern Congo and Ituri province was being financed. That Hema and Lendu conflict that was being financed by the access to gold is ongoing. And whilst I worked together with Human Rights Watch at that time to highlight the way that the international community was implicated in the extraction of that gold and assisting certain rebel groups in some of their work, and Anglo Gold Ashanti was held to account by Human Rights Watch, and Metalor Technologies, another mining company, was held to, or commodity trading company, was held to account by Human Rights Watch, and they stopped buying gold from this region, or they changed their practices in this region. But then the buyers just changed, and so a lot of the final purchases moved from a European-based Swiss purchaser, which was Metalor Technologies at the time, to a United Arab Emirates purchaser. And so basically from 2006 until today and ongoing today, most of the gold that comes from the conflict regions in Eastern Congo, it ends up in the United Arab Emirates. And it's a lot more difficult to influence purchasing in the United Arab Emirates than it is in Switzerland. And so, the conflict, the Hema Lendu conflict that we see, the resurgence of that since 2017, and the Codeco insurgency from, beginning or end, 2019 into 2020, all of this is about, is being financed by gold. And so that's clearly ongoing. The other minerals that are being used, more technologically focused minerals, so tin, tantalum, tungsten, the 3 Ts they're called. They are what we use in our mobile phones, in our computers. The vibration that we have on our mobile phones, the ringtones, all of this, all of those minerals are embedded in our communications and computer equipment that we use today. And of course, DRC is one of the largest deposits of many of these minerals. And historically, they have been quite a significant source of conflict since 2000, 2001, especially for, those 3 Ts. And so increasingly through the work that I've done and others, especially Human Rights Watch and the Enough Project, we've been focusing and working together to try to bring policymakers to understand the implications that conflict minerals have on population and conflict. And so the Dodd-Frank Act that President Obama put into law whilst he was a president, that created a foundation for reporting for American corporations, listed corporations, to declare whether they had any minerals in their supply chain that were coming from Eastern Congo. And that started a journey for corporate America, and then later on global corporate institutions, to try to investigate and clean up their supply chain. And so organizations like Apple and Intel and Dell really started to look at the eastern part of DRC, not to exit that region, because the community in that region really needs these companies to source their minerals from that area, because economically it's essential for the well-being of the communities there. And so how could they do that in a transparent and safe way? And so they spent a long time to methodically clean up the mines, to first of all get kids out of the mines, and secondly get women and pregnant women out of the mines so they're not used as labor when they're pregnant, and then get military out of the mines, which took a lot longer. And now there is a rating system for all of the mines in Eastern Congo that has been put in place and financed by these global technological companies like Apple and Dell and Intel, to really create a transparent supply chain. And so they basically track it from the mine all the way through to the smelter to make sure that supply chain is a clean one. And I'm not saying that 100% of the mines where we source tin, tantalum, and tungsten are clean, but they're a lot more clean than they were in 2005. And so do we still have conflict minerals in our laptops? I'm sure we do. But I see that there is a chance and an opportunity at some point in the future that we could have a sticker on our computers that says conflict free. And I didn't see that in 2005. So we're closer to that point, I think.
Like you said, another issue even I was reading about is how tightening policies around the conflict minerals is also affecting livelihoods in Congo. So just banning, mining around these conflict zones won't really help the issue. I wanted to understand how can we come to a compromise which would benefit both the parties here.
Initially, the initial response by President Kabila when he was president and the international community was to just withdraw. President Kabila closed down all of the mining areas when the Dodd-Frank Act was signed and put into law, and that decimated the local community economically. And that's definitely not the right way of doing things. And then since then, I think that the international community has learned that if they're going to put in policies to clean up mines and move children out of them and move women out of them and move military out of them, they have to give other sources of economy for these groups in order to encourage them to stay out of the mines. And so, invest in this education system and the schools that surround them, support it and finance education, make it compulsory for kids to go to school, make sure that there are other sources of support for women so that they can make an income outside of the mines, so they're not forced to go to the mines to make money. And then negotiate with the military to keep them out of the mines and make sure that they understand that it's really in the economic interest of the whole community to have a transparent mining system so that the economics of that asset is exploited for the benefit of the population and not the benefit of a few warlords. Because, let's face it, if it becomes more attractive for a 19-year-old boy to pick up a Kalashnikov and fight with a particular warlord because they know that they can use that to make money, and if he can make more money doing that than setting up a taxi service or becoming a joiner or an electrician or an engineer, then of course they're going to do that. But as soon as we start investing in the local economy and creating opportunities for the creation of those jobs, the joiners and the electricians and the engineers and the teachers, then if 95% of the population is going to benefit from peacetime, then it's going to be very difficult to motivate a population towards becoming soldiers, and that they can really focus on peacetime activities and support their families with those peacetime activities, which is why a lot of the international communities are investing in significant infrastructures in hydroelectric dams and electric systems to make it easier for organizations and individuals to make money in a legitimate way. So we have to invest in the economy basically and the society to make sure that war is less attractive than what you could have in peacetime.
In your third book, The Unraveling, you documented the war in CAR, Central African Republic. Could you give everyone a brief about the book? What's the narrative here?
Yeah, so I was asked at the end of 2012, beginning of 2013, to start to look at the Central African Republic because I'd spent a lot of time in that country. Bizarrely enough, it's one of the most forgotten countries in Africa, never mind Central Africa. And so when Human Rights Watch called me to say that they were interested in learning a little bit more and that there were some potential challenges around rebel groups being formed, I agreed. I wanted to go and try to understand more. And then later in 2013, we went, I think mid-2013, July, August, to really, what had happened was that there was a group called Seleka, which in local language means coalition, sort of coming together of people And they've been formed from lots of different backgrounds, but a lot of them from individuals that had been put into exile or challenged by the current president, Bozezi. And so, many of the clear actors, and one of them was Michael Jitodia, who became the leader of the Seleka, were ex-soldiers of Bozezi, working with him in the presidential guard and working very high up in his military. And so as a result of one action or another, many of them had been put into exile, been put into jail, and had either broken out of jail or been released. And they came together in 2012, and they started to move towards Bangui, the capital of Central African Republic. And, cutting a long story short, they overthrew the government, displaced President Bozezi and his government, and took power. Interestingly enough, the Seleka at that time were made up of Muslims and Christians and animists, and there was no real focus. There was a big mix of backgrounds, religious backgrounds, in the Seleka at the time. And so what then happened with that Seleka rule? A lot of the time, if you start to recruit as a movement moves towards a city and becomes the perception of their movement becomes more promising, and that they might be successful in this mission, they tend to recruit more people. And so initially, there may be 50 people, and then there are 250 people, then there are 1,000 people, then there are 5,000 people. So the closer they get to the capital and the bigger chance of success, then more people jump on board. But of course, these people need some sort of agreement of payment at some point, and you don't have the money to pay 5,000 people. And so at some point, you have to come to an agreement of how you're going to pay these 5,000 people. And, there was, of course, money in the central bank, and there's money in the government. So when they took over the central areas of Bangui, they had access to that money, or some of it. But there's not a lot there. This is Central African Republic. There are not millions and millions that are stashed there. So how do these people get paid? Very similar to the way the soldiers in Sierra Leone paid themselves in 1997 and 1998. It became this concept of Operation Pay Yourself. Because you had a vehicle and you had a weapon, then you had the means to take what you wanted from the population. And so that became the way many of these soldiers paid themselves. And they focused a lot on the Christian and animist populations. And so it started to fracture along religious lines ever so slightly. And so a lot of these individuals, because they had come from Sudan and Chad and northern parts of Central African Republic, where a large part of the Muslim population lived, a large percentage, but not everybody in the Seleka were Muslim. There were Christians there and there were animists there too, but a smaller percentage. But increasingly, these groups became fractured along these religious lines. And then the leaders of these two groups, the Seleka and the responding military movement called the Anti-Balaka, started to use religion as a tool and as a communication tool to rally both responses against the population and also troops to come and join them. And so it started to fracture along these religious lines, Muslim against Christian and animist population. But that was really a manipulated movement by the leaders of those movements. And so, for a while, Michael Jitodia and the Seleka movement controlled Bangui, and these people were attacking these rural communities and stealing food and animals and killing and raping. And of course, this created a fear amongst the local population, and they started to move outside of their homes and started to live in the bush. And that's when Human Rights Watch and I came along, and we started to document the lives of those people living in the bush as a result of running from the Seleka. And so we spent several months documenting that. And then this movement started to respond to this Seleka incursion, and that was the Anti-Balaka. And the Anti-Balaka were really a local militia that were in place for many, many years in Central African Republic, protecting the roads from bandits. They were a local defense force in all of the villages. And anti-balaka stands for anti-machete, so meaning that you fight against the people that come into your villages with machetes to steal things. And so that anti-balaka movement was formed on a national level as a response to the Seleka. And a lot of the people from Bozizé's military group started to get involved in it, and they started to be financed and get better weapons. And so they started to face off against the Seleka. And in early December 2013, that came to a head, and the anti-balaka started to move on Bongi. And then, again, a long story short, by the beginning of 2014, I think, January, February 2014, the regime of the Seleka fell. Michael Jatori was called to Chad by Idriss Déby from Chad, who is really the kingmaker of the region, the president of Chad. You know, if you're not doing things in the right way, then Chad, because of the oil and the petrodollars that they have there, they become a very powerful force. And Michael Jatori was asked to step down and go into exile, which he did. But that left a big vacuum of power in Bongi in the Central African Republic. And so there started to be this infighting, but also more importantly, this population of animists and Christians that had been so oppressed for many months started to rise up and started to vent their anger and frustration against the largely innocent Muslim population that had been living peacefully for many years, decades, with the Christian population. They've been intermarried. You know, this is one of the communities in Africa where these two religious communities were as integrated as they could be. And so, you know, you had families ripped apart along these religious lines, a husband going one way, wife going another, because of their religion. And so over time, this pressure that was put on the Muslim population by the civilian and sometimes organized by the anti-balaka militarily, the pressure that the Muslim population felt started to drive them out of their homes. And then I think at the end of that process, nearly 600,000 Muslims were ethnically cleansed from Central African Republic. And again, today you have a fracture amongst northeast and southwest of Central African Republic, where southwest is predominantly Christian and animist, and northeast is predominantly Muslim. And you know, they draw a line pretty much across the country. And whilst we, you know, see Central African Republic as a single state, it actually has two parts to it. Very similar to the way Nigeria, you know, experienced, you know, their secession in the 70s and 80s, and now come together. But they have this power sharing agreement between the North and the South in Nigeria. I think at some point in the future, a similar sort of solution will happen in CAR, but it's going to take a long time.
Who is Joseph Kony, and what does his group, the Lord's Resistance Army, want?
Yeah. Joseph Kony is an individual who believes very much in, who uses not the occult, but the concept of spirituality and witches and you know, the unknown spiritual side of life, which many people in the communities that Joseph Kony comes from, especially in northern Uganda, the Acholi people, and then people in northeastern Congo and southeastern Central African Republic. Those three areas are where Kony has been operating for many years. And they believe in this spirituality, and they believe in the life of spirits in their community, and he uses and abuses that. And so what he has done systematically for many years, 20, 30 years now, is to abduct children at a very large scale and use them for his personal use and the war effort. So, you know, he abducts children very young and indoctrinates them and forces them to commit horrific acts against each other, so that they feel that there is no way that they can ever return to their old life. So they abduct them in schools, in their tens and hundreds sometimes, and they take them to the bush. So, you know, let's say they abduct 50 children from a school, and they take them to the bush, and they get one or two children gang up against other children and kill them. And it's a collective process. So each child will have one blow against the other child, and 50 children, let's say, are involved in killing this one child. And those 50 children then feel that there's no way they can return back to their community because of what they've done. And so they feel in some way that this is the only option for them. And so he does this time and time and time again. And these young children, they grow up and they become fighters, soldiers in the Lord's Resistance Army and commanders in the Lord's Resistance Army. And, I've met many of them who've managed to leave and tell me their stories of, 15, 20 years that they've spent as a soldier in the Lord's Resistance Army. They were abducted at the age of 11. And then, they managed to escape at the age of 30. They've lost 20 years of their life, and they tell me what Joseph Kony and his commanders used to make them do in order to keep them in that community. And then he uses the young girls as sex slaves and his wives, basically. And he uses the girls as payment to his commanders for good work. So then they can have one wife or two, and they get another young girl when they come in. And that's essentially how he pays his commanders. But he uses the occult and spirituality to really control the minds of these young children and his commanders. It's quite a horrific organization. But he's abducted tens of thousands of children over the years.
And he's still not been caught, right?
No. Many of his commanders have either escaped or been caught or been killed. So there's a lot of historical infighting within the Lord's Resistance Army. But he's not been caught. We don't even know if he's still alive.
Another interesting project that you did was covering the child marriages that were rampant in Tanzania. I wanted to know if these child marriages are a part of the culture there, or is it forced, or both?
Yeah. So, child marriages in that region are quite common. Not just Tanzania, but across East Africa and Central Africa. When, some of the people, the young girls we were meeting in the conflict in Central African Republic, maybe they were 19 and they had 5 children. How did that happen? How early did they start raising a family? And so it's quite normal in areas like that, whether it's right or not, but it's quite normal in very rural areas for children to be married at the age of 13. It wasn't the project in Tanzania wasn't just focused on child marriages. It was focused around the issue of female genital mutilation and the impact that female genital mutilation, or FGM, has on communities. And that is definitely a cultural thing that has happened for centuries. And the international community has this large movement to try to stop the practice. And it's very difficult, but slowly we're trying, or organizations are trying to educate local populations and try to, if young girls are at risk of being operated on in early age, then they're removed from their families and their communities and they're put into safe houses. And so that project that I did for Human Rights Watch was really focused on female genital mutilation, and that is embedded in the culture. But it's definitely a practice that the international community has focused on trying to address and reduce. It's a desperately difficult and sad process and story, and there are many girls that are removed from their families as a result of being at risk from this happening to them. Because if we think of the prospects of young girls, if they get married at 13, what are their opportunities to empower themselves and feel individual and autonomous and economically empowered as an individual as well as part of a marriage? They're very limited. It's clear that if you get married at such a young age, then the challenges that you will have going forward are quite significant, and the opportunities that you will have are quite reduced. It's no surprise that educating young girls and creating better family planning are two of the most impactful things actually that we could do to reduce global warming. And if we can educate our young girls and get them through high school to a point where they can feel that they have the opportunity to empower themselves economically, then that has the opportunity to allow us to make different decisions about family and the size of families and economic empowerment and the ability to feed ourselves. And so there are significant benefits for communities and global communities to make sure that young girls are educated so that they don't fall into this trap of child marriage, and that the communities don't force on them FGM to follow cultural practices. It's really an essential issue of our time.
But why is FGM done? Like, won't the husbands or the family be happy for the woman to conceive?
It doesn't. Well, it does definitely impact your ability to conceive, but it impacts your whole life basically after that operation. But it's a cultural thing, It still happens in many religions, both in male and female, and it's been a cultural thing. People have said it's for health reasons. Largely, it's for control, both of communities and the male population over the female population historically. And so it's an ability for the male population to say, once this happens, a lot of the women are actually then sewn up and are only allowed a small hole that they can go to the toilet with, so that can almost guarantee for the family whose daughter this is, that they can hand this child to their future husband with a guarantee that they have not been with another man. And it's kind of also embedded in that part of the culture. So it's a really challenging situation that has centuries of culture embedded in it. It's very difficult to change. But there are now communities and organizations teaching women groups and men's groups, leaders in these communities, that this is no longer the right way to treat our children. And slowly, the practice is changing, but it's going to take a long time.
And lastly, I wanted to know about your assignment in Kashmir in India. So before we start, firstly, how did you find your visit to India?
I loved it. I'd been to India before and Nepal a lot many years ago, and I'd done a lot of work around kind of the Maoist movement in Nepal in the 2004 to 2008. So I'd covered that conflict a lot, and so I'd been in India and in Nepal covering that quite a lot. But then going to Kashmir was really, I was invited there first to hold a workshop actually for young local students and international students to study photography, and they invited me there to talk and teach them how to work as a photographer in places like that. And then I started just to go back because I loved the community and the population and the area. It's just beautiful in all levels, and it was really a great place to be. And so, but of course, sad because of the conflict and the impact that has on the population. And so that there was this, two sides to it, and I did just that. You can shoot the beauty of that place and the horror of that place in the same moment. And it's a little bit like Congo in that respect. Congo is so beautiful, but it has such horror. And I saw that in Kashmir, that there were such injustices happening there. And on both sides, actually, but in such areas of beauty. And it was a really interesting and fascinating place. And it's sad to see that we still can't come together as communities to solve that problem. It's a real challenge.
So what were you documenting in Kashmir?
I was documenting the conflict there. So really what was happening on the streets during the times when the local population was demonstrating against the occupancy of the presence of Indian troops. And what happened then to local families as a result of that? How religious life and how communities have been really embedded and intertwined into this conflict for years. So it's really looking at again, the impact of conflict on community. But one great thing about Kashmir and the population there is that they have fantastic journalists and fantastic photographers doing really great work to document their own communities. And so, increasingly, I've been working, not just me, but many other photographers, trying to empower local communities to document their own. They don't need people like me coming from Oslo to document communities like Kashmir. You have fantastic photographers that are there living in it and then, and being in it day in, day out. And so it's a really important part of our jobs as journalists internationally to empower local communities and local journalists and photographers to do this work themselves and to hold their own governments to account and their own communities to account and appeal to policymakers on a daily basis as a result of the things that they live, rather than international photographers and journalists coming in for a period of time and leaving. It's so much more powerful, I think, coming from that community.
So what is your take on the conflict in Kashmir? What did you see? I wanted to know what is the perspective of someone who's not from either of the countries involved.
I view it like every other conflict as there is no need for conflict. We should sit down and have a diplomatic dialogue in order to solve problems. And so, whether we consider Kashmir as occupied or whether we consider Kashmir as part of another country or independent or, need to be autonomous, I think the clear solution for places, and not just Kashmir, but there are many around the world, it's dialogue. We have to sit down and we have to have the opportunity to have a conversation about how two very diverse populations live together in harmony. And so, I don't take a side either way on the politics, but I know where the future is, and it's not continued killing. It is the future rests in dialogue, and future populations need to understand that if they're going to live together in an economically vibrant region, they have to talk and they have to sit down and they have to engage in compromise. That's the only way we solve conflict. I think it's quite interesting that we've had an hour and 15-minute conversation about photography and we haven't spoken about a photograph. And I think that's the really important thing here, that we have spoken about the issues that surround it and the politics and the history and the people. And not once did we talk about a photograph. And I think that's what photography is about. It's about the people and the history and the politics and the policy making and the things that we're trying to change with it. And I think that that's a really important part maybe of this overall message.